Welcome to Constitutional Chess, Jim.
Thank
Your
you. Nice
episodes are
to be
always,
here.
yeah, it's great. It's great to have you here. Your episodes are always fabulous. And now we're going to talk about buying Greenland, a constitutional deep dive. This has a lot of people split. I'll be amazed if President Trump can pull this off because these countries have pride and they don't exactly want to just go, sure, we'll become, an adjunct of America. So you're going to give a little preview for us, and I'll come back and ask many questions about treaties in the past and that sort of thing. And how does it benefit Greenland to actually put? I mean, if Trump pulls this off, it really will be the deal of the century. So,
It, it,
Jim, we're
if
handing it over to you.
if we can pull it off, it would be epic. I mean, it would be akin to the Louisiana Purchase. Greenland is about a quarter the size of the United States. It would be a pretty significant addition to the U.S. It has estimates that range around $25 trillion worth of rare earth elements and other minerals in it. 25 trillion is a lot of money. And it has enormous strategic benefits in terms of, dealing with the Russians and the Chinese and so on. And it would certainly be horrible if the Russians or Chinese were to get there before we did. I mean, that would just be, disastrous. So it's kind of important that we get there first. But of course, as we, think about Greenland, starting with the Constitution, the question that's been kicking around since about 2019, when President Trump first raised the issue of buying Greenland, although of course the idea at one time or another has been kicked around in the 19th century and the 20th century, but it sort of came back in the first Trump administration. And then since the second Trump administration has become a pretty substantial focus, and I've written about it for both the American Conservative and Breitbart. It's now, I think, a real prospect. I mean, if the Europeans, including Denmark, want us to defend them against the Russians or the Chinese or the North Koreans, what's in it for us? I mean, if we're the ones with the enormous defense budget, they're the ones with the tiny defense budget. And so if they can't afford or are unwilling to spend on their own defense, then maybe they should sell off some assets, of which Greenland comes to mind first.
Okay. All right. So I don't know where Jordan is, but it would be great to put that map up. I think Jordan stepped away, but we have a map, a bird's eye view. Oh, he's there. He's not in his chair, but he's there. That's a mystery. Okay, look at that. Let's just look at that, everybody. So the Arctic Ocean, Jim, isn't the Arctic Ocean also is it Antarctica, Arctic? I think it's Arctic. Which one is it that China is
Arctic is up there by Greenland.
Well, that I know, that I understand, but China is trying to impede either the Arctic or Antarctica. Which one is it currently that
Well,
China's trying to?
if you look at the map there, you see across the Arctic Ocean is a good chunk of Russia and Siberia and so on. And so look, it's very much in dispute whether global warming or climate change is happening. Who knows? But it's certainly more than theoretically possible that the Arctic Ocean could, become more of a waterway, less of an iceway, more of a waterway. And of course, as technology improves with icebreakers and so on, and also tunneling capacity. I mean, there's a reason why airplanes, when they want to go from, say, Europe to America, they fly over the North Pole, because if you look at the map there, it's actually, look at the globe, it's actually shorter to fly from, say, London to New York over the Arctic as opposed to straight across. So there's actually a strategic value in thinking about potentially even a tunnel between, say, North America and Europe or Russia or China. And there's a million ways to think about this. And so with better technology and sort of greater thinking on things, we realize, yes, that we've always understood that the Atlantic and the Pacific are vital to American security. The Arctic Ocean is looking the same way.
Okay, so I'm going to ask an elementary question for our students. The Arctic, the North and South Pole is the Arctic, right? And then the Atlantic is the South Pole.
Arctic is north.
All right. Okay. Obviously, yes. So I'm just reiterating for the students. The land in the Arctic region, it says the land. So there is land there, is there not? We're looking at a map that just says the ocean, but I'm looking it up. Arctic land is the land of the Arctic region, which is the northernmost part of the Earth. And then in the South Pole, there's land too. Isn't there some land here?
There's no land above the surface in the Arctic. There's ice. There's ice
Okay.
all over the place, and so there's a mile thick of ice. But the Antarctic is enormous. The Antarctic has a lot of land, and that's another whole issue, of course, is the disposition of the Antarctic in the south. But for Greenland purposes, right now, it's the Arctic that matters. And so, as the map says, it's you know blue or blue water or of course ice between Greenland and northern Canada and Alaska and Europe and Russia.
Okay, so I just looked it up. China, because I was wondering where China was trying to impede, and it says here China has a growing presence in Antarctica with interest in science, resources, tourism, and shipping. So one of the things I was trying to, and we can probably take that down now too. Thank you. But one of the things I was trying to discern was where was China trying to impede with the land grab, and I guess if there's just if Antarctica has more land and the Arctic has mainly ice, they're going for it just says here they're going for the Antarctic.
Well,
Nevertheless, it is a viable piece of land, Greenland, that's right there in a strategic position that is rather brilliant. It sort of parallels Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, which was a debate whether he could even really do that or not at the time, but he did it. He did it anyway, and he helped, from France construct the United States Constitution. So Denmark currently, this is Denmark's land, is it not? And do you think Denmark is really going to do this?
well, Greenland considers itself to be independent from Denmark. However, the Danes don't really agree, and it's not a member of the United Nations. It's an ambiguous piece of territory. Like, look, most of the world has, I would say much of the world has some ambiguity as to exactly who owns it, who claims it, who owns it, and so on. So the Greenlanders are, by some reckonings, independent, and some reckonings they are dependent on Denmark. And so their exact legal status is, under question. And, that's one of the things the United States has
Well,
to.
how could their legal status be under question? I mean, they're either owned by Denmark and part of their country, or they're not. Is there not a
Well, I mean,
treaty?
again, it's Puerto
They have
Rico.
no proof.
It's
I mean, is
Puerto
there
Rico's
not an executive agreement or anything? I mean, how can they kind of maybe be part of Denmark and maybe not be part of Denmark?
welcomed international law. Is Greenland, is Puerto Rico part of the United States? Yes, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but it's not a state. They're citizens, but they don't have, voting power in presidential elections. So there's lots of territory that this
So
is just,
what is Denmark? Is Greenland a territory of Denmark then?
again, they would say they're an independent country within the Danish realm.
Like Puerto Rico would say? I think Puerto Rico, they would say
Somewhat like Puerto Rico's. And again, I mean, there are about 200 countries in the United Nations, but there are thousands and thousands of different territories with different legal statuses all over the world. And that sometimes they're called possessions, sometimes they're called territories, sometimes they're called protectorates.
So if you had to negotiate to buy Greenland, make Greenland a territory of the United States, with whom would you negotiate? Do you not have to? Because I've seen
you probably
Denmark come out. I've seen the king. I've seen the whoever is in charge of Denmark come out and say we are not interested in selling. This is not going to happen. So who does the Trump administration? With whom do they negotiate then?
I think
Denmark or
I think
Greenland?
realistically we'll be negotiating with both Greenland and Denmark, both.
Okay. Okay. Well, that makes sense. All right. So let's go back, and you're so knowledgeable in this area. Let's talk about the history of America buying states like Alaska and Hawaii, or Puerto Rico, that's a territory, and things of that nature. And I have a list here. There was that came from your notes. Louisiana Purchase. We all know what that was. Then there's the Guano Island Act of 1856, and then the Executive Agreement in World War II. Now, it's interesting that that's not a treaty because executive agreements can technically be overturned by the next president. So that was that during. So let's walk through the last two of these. Let's walk through the Guano let's walk through the Guano Island Act of 1856. Tell us why that happened and what was attained.
I mean, again, the Constitution declares in Article 4 that for the U.S. to add a state, it takes an act of Congress. You know, Article 2 covers treaties, and so with those two, you know, the acquisition of a state. I mean, again, the founders knew back in 1789 the country would expand. It was seen as a vital security issue that the U.S. have control over the North American continent, and that meant, you know, the big enemy back then, frankly, was Canada. You know, Canada was then part of Great Britain, and Great Britain was oftentimes hostile power. We fought the Revolution against them, of course, and also the War of 1812 against them. So it was very much seen as, how do we keep the Canadians and the British from encroaching on American territory? And along the way, we also had to think about the French and the Spanish, who had Florida, and the Russians, who had Alaska and a good chunk of Northwest Canada back then, and then other countries too that might potentially, you know, France intervened in Mexico in during the U.S. Civil War.
Okay, well, let's stop right there because it's getting kind of confusing. Is this manifest destiny that we're talking about? That America has the right to this area?
The American journalist John L. O'Sullivan in 1836 or so coined the phrase manifest destiny and said it is a sort of a moral and political and geopolitical requirement that we not get stuck the way the Europeans got stuck with an enemy country across the frontier.
Okay. France and Germany. Yes, I remember that. Okay, so I'm looking at the Guano Islands Act, and it says it was the United States federal law passed by Congress that enabled citizens of the United States to take possession of unclaimed islands containing guano deposits. That was used for fertilizer, I think. It also empowers the president to use the military to protect such interests. So the Guano Island Act looked like they wanted a particular substance, and that gave them the right to go. So the Guano Island Act, interesting, it allowed them to take possession of unclaimed islands. So that was passed in 1856, but the unclaimed islands that contained guano. So interesting. History is fascinating. So, but would you consider Greenland to be an unclaimed island? I mean, I don't think the guano is pertinent to Greenland. But
no,
would you say
it's not. But
island?
it's the Guano Island Act of 1856. When guano, bird poop, to put it, was a vital substance for fertilizer and chemicals. In addition to Article 2 and Article 4 on treaties and the acquisition of states. The lesson of the Constitution is the founders had a vision of how exactly some things would work, but they also understood that territory would come into possession of the United States through other means. So the Louisiana Purchase, for example, was just an executive purchase. Congress ultimately ratified it, but it was an executive purchase. The treaty that gave us Florida was an assumption of debt from Spain. The process by which we got Mexico, California, and Texas was a war. That was a treaty. There's been probably 10 different mechanisms by which we ended up with territory. After World War II, we ended up with Okinawa and a whole, which is part of Japan. And we held that until 1971. We still have, I think, 32 bases on Okinawa, even though it's now been reverted back to Japanese territory. Along the way, the Guano Island Act in the mid-19th century just seemed like a good idea to both, Congress and back then President Pierce. They said, of course, if America is a maritime power and we have ships sailing around and we need guano, then we should be able to claim some of the 600,000 islands around the world. Nobody else wants them. We'll take them. And it was a smart thing to do. And we still have hundreds of islands including sort of quasi islands like the Kingman Reef in the South Pacific, which is an enormous patch of territory that the United States owns, that we use a little bit during World War II to fight the Japanese. But all these possessions, they've come into, they're not states, and their exact status is somewhere between a territory and a possession. Again, lawyers and international, scribblers can kind of debate over what the right term for them is, but all of them are incredibly valuable for both mineral and strategic mineral reasons and wealth reasons, but also for strategy reasons. Again, it is essential to American security that the perimeter, if you will, of the United States be outside of U.S. territory. You do not want to be fighting a defensive war on your own territory. You want to be fighting a defensive war with a perimeter, whether the perimeter is, the Azores Islands, or for Greenland or Iceland. During World War II, we occupied Iceland just as a strategy point on dealing with the Germans. Hawaii, Guam. We've made lots of choices like that over the last 2.5 centuries that have mercifully kept a war other than the U.S. Civil War from coming to the American homeland.
What's in it for Greenland? And even though I could take a little more time here because we didn't have really an intro discussion, but I'll let this be one of my last 2 questions. So what are the odds that you think this is going to happen? I mean, how does this benefit Greenland?
Well, Greenland is about 50,000 people, which is very poor because the Danes, who being politically correct and excruciatingly conscious of climate change and net zero and all this stuff, have simply chosen to keep it as an ice preserve, as a national park. And if you divide $25 trillion relative to the 50,000 people of Greenland, even after you subtract the cost of mining and developing the territory, you still get a possible benefit to Greenlanders that would really literally be in the hundreds of millions of dollars per person. And again, this has happened in the United States, where we have territory with a sparse population and abundant resources. For example, Alaska. The Alaskans brilliantly wrote into their constitution that, and became a state in 1959, that if there are natural resources in Alaska, there should be a dividend to the citizens of Alaska. And so, for example, last year, every living person, man, woman, child in Alaska got a check from the state of Alaska for $1,300. And depending on oil prices, it's been as high as $3,000. I mean, that's not bad for a family of 4 to get a check from the government for $5,000 just for being there. And, Texas, about 12% of the University of Texas budget is dedicated oil revenue. Long ago, in their wisdom, the government of Texas decided we will take some oil patches and just dedicate their revenues to the education of our young people. And so you can think in those terms, and create sovereign wealth funds. Every country from Saudi Arabia to Norway has a sovereign wealth fund. You could create one of those for Greenland, for the United States, and it'd be worth a lot. And all this is possible if you get out from under the green regime of these people who just want to just look at glaciers all day and not even look at glaciers, just have the warm thought as they sit in Copenhagen, thinking that somewhere there's a glacier that isn't being touched. And that's, to my reckoning, and I think to most people's reckoning, it's kind of a waste of resources. We're in a struggle with the Chinese over natural rare earths and so on and so on. We need to develop these things. The Greenlanders have it. The Danes don't want to use it. We would, Trump would. And I think that's the beginning of a beautiful relationship where we say, listen, if you agree to be part of the United States, we'll make y'all millionaires. Kind of a good bargain.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So they can as long as Denmark doesn't try to claim that they're not allowed to do it, that if they were to partner with America, they could get a percentage of all the wealth that could be mined in their country. So that's really interesting. Thank you. I'm going to pass because I can't hoard all the time, unfortunately. So I don't know if Julie, you to go next or Wyatt goes next. So how does this go?
I'm ready to go. And
Okay, go, Jewel.
Wyatt.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Jim. Thank you so much so far. This is Jewel Gilbert, and I'm excited to start talking about this. purchase possible of Greenland. So my first question would be, you were talking about the very complicated distinctions that we have for different territories, possessions, etc. If, in your opinion, what do you think would be most beneficial for America if we were to somehow assume Greenland? Would you think that it would be best to actually have the possibility of making Greenland a state, or some form of possession or territory, or what do you think?
I tend to think, it maximizes the civic unity of a country if all its citizens are treated equally. And so, there's a slight asymmetry in, for example, Puerto Rico or American Samoa. These are American possessions. They are U.S. citizens. They can receive U.S. benefits, but they have a different tax system, and they can vote for a non-voting delegate. I mean, a delegate, not a representative, who has very, very limited voting power in the U.S. Congress. They can vote in committees, but they can't vote on the floor. Okay, and so I without getting into the merits of statehood for Puerto Rico or statehood for American Samoa or Guam and so on, I think that the Greenlanders would be best off if they were a U.S. state, which would then, give them 2 U.S. senators and a member of Congress, and then, I think that would be, again, on the theory that the best civics is when all citizens are equal participants in the polity. I think that would be the best. Again, but obviously this is what has to get negotiated with, Greenland, with Denmark, and with the U.S. Congress, because there'd be plenty of consideration given, each political party each would be making a calculation. Do I think, the Greenlanders will be Democrats or Republicans and so on? Those kind of issues would come up. I mean, and sometimes the calculations are wrong. Both Alaska and Hawaii became United States states in 1959, and the wisdom back then was that Hawaii was Republican and Alaska was Democratic. Of course, these days it's the exact opposite. One is completely Democratic, Hawaii, and the other is completely Republican, Alaska. So, you can make predictions about this kind of stuff and make calculations, and you might well be wrong. But I think Greenland is so important and so vital that I would like to think that, we could make it full state and then allow the movement of Americans to Greenland. I think that's one of the, I wrote about this for American Conservative. One of the untapped resources that applies to the entire planet, not just Greenland, is geothermal power. I mean, the core of the Earth is about 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, the core of the Earth is the same temperature as the surface of the sun. It's decaying radioisotopes down there. So that's why it gets warmer as you go down deeper into the Earth. And I think the potential for Greenland, which again is about a quarter the size of the United States, to have millions and millions and millions of people living in some sort of geothermal powered, warmed, perhaps under the ice or something, is enormous. And I mean, President Trump back in 2023, when he was running for president, said we should be building new cities across the country to have lower housing costs and sort of generally distribute the population and let people own land and so on. That's a good idea for Alaska or North Dakota, perhaps. It's an even better idea, to my reckoning, for Greenland. I mean, just to say, listen, if you're willing to do the homestead thing, as tough as it is, and Greenland is average temperature about -10, so I'm not minimizing the difficulty here. I also know that people really want to better themselves and own property and work hard. They'll put up with almost anything in terms of the difficulty to make it work, and that's to be applauded.
Yeah. Of course, none of this may happen. Of course, this is all hypothetical, but for a moment, it's just enthralling to imagine that frontier spirit, which is somewhat fundamental to Americanism, at the possibility of that being rekindled so sharply, so directly, as when you bring up something like land ownership, something that is part of the American dream, truly, and in a unique way, because as we did, as you know, we moved west, and even in settling Alaska, although I don't know very much about that, but a little bit about that. This frontiersmanship and this ability to think that Greenland could be that in some way, certainly would shape the future of what America would become, either, if no matter what designation that territory had, if in any way we come in possession of it and it becomes in some way controlled by America, it will definitively shape the future, I believe, because of everything that you've just described. So when you're thinking about the strategic military benefits, and of course now some of it sounds like sci-fi, but with all the recent technology developments, like, it may be around the corner. What do you think? I know that there's economic, and I know that there are defense considerations here. Do you think that one of those, and I know those are linked as well, but do you think that one of these is like clearly one of the main reasons why you think that this is a good, why this would be a good idea, why this would be a positive for America's future? Do you believe that economic, defense, also the quality of life for Americans? What do you think, if you had to pick one, or do you think it's really around the board that is generally good? And then, do you think that there's a possible negative?
Well, you mentioned that economics, defense, and quality of life. You mentioned three different but overlapping components: the economics of the resources that we talked about, the quality of life. Again, it's great to live in a city. It's great to live in the suburbs. It's also great to have the choice. I just am tired of it here. I want to go somewhere. I want to, start something new. I mean, that's such a healthy instinct in people in the frontier. It helped, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about this 200 years ago as one of the, great attributes of the American population was this sort of frontier, do-it-yourself, rugged individualistic spirit, very much to be admired and celebrated. And then also the defense aspects. Again, we want, we already have this. It used to be an Air Force base. Now it's a space base in Thule, Greenland, and we have other military facilities there. It is very much in our interest to have radar and sensors and so on way in advance of as a forward projection from the United States for defense. If we got attacked at Pearl Harbor in 1941, it was better they bomb Hawaii than they bomb California, and in terms of our own defense. So I think all three are really kind of equal. I think, as part of the politics of this, as part of the domestic year 2025 considerations, again, those three issues you raised, defense, quality of life, and resources are all important. And, the American people will have to decide whether they want this to happen or not, if it could happen. And I think it'd just be an interesting exercise to see, what political message, if you will, sells best. Which one of those three? Maybe all three, maybe one, two, or three are different. But I think it's an exciting venture, including, again, although I must say that the economic part of it, of just simply saying, how much can we sell, all the lithium in Greenland for, is pretty darn tempting. And the ability to make that into a dividend for Greenlanders and also potentially Americans too. Again, it's just pull out your calculator and start calculating what it's worth, and then say, listen, now we're having a little bit of a auction almost as to how to best arrange this. And I think it's hard for me to believe the American people wouldn't get excited over it.
My last question before I pass to Wyatt is, there is a knee-jerk reaction that has somewhat become acculturated on elements of the left and the right, and that is that America acquiring any land, and that America's current state is somewhat imperialistic, is somewhat some way, and that in some way inherently makes life also worse for Americans, which is more so the flavor it takes on the right than the left. What is your take on? It's not always a thought out critique. Oftentimes it's more of an assumed, sometimes emotional stance. And with this Greenland, you see it bubbling up sometimes when in this Greenland discussion. And I'm sure that if we have any school listeners, I can almost guarantee that some of our school listeners have had teachers pass comments with that bent. So somewhat of just having more of a negative reaction to America acquiring any land, expanding its borders at all. What would you think? What would your response to that be? And not necessarily like a thought out debate, but just that many people have a knee jerk reaction that is inherently negative.
Well, you're right. If you call it imperialism or colonialism, people would say, well, that's bad. I think if you call it just expanding America and creating a new state with new citizens, that's, again, you asked me what status I think the Greenlanders would have ideally. I'd say they should be equal U.S. citizens with full legal political rights, and that would then it's not colonialism anymore. It's expansion, but it's not colonialism. It's now, look, welcome to America, you new citizens, and again, it's a political optical debate, and again, to study the history of how we gained Louisiana, or how we gained California, or how we gained Florida, or how we gained the Kingman Reef in the South Pacific. They're all different stories and different situations, and I think the overall wisdom of the United States and its statecraft has been, yes, we are better off being bigger than smaller. We are better off, making sure that our enemies are as far away as possible, behind a perimeter of Hawaii and, the Azores and the Bermuda. And we bought from Denmark, from the very same Denmark, we bought the Virgin Islands in 1917, in part because it was kind of cool to have, Caribbean territory. In large part, though, we were very worried about protecting the Panama Canal, which is a vital resource, another area that President Trump has talked about. And again, if you just look at a map of the Caribbean, you say, well, yeah, if you want to keep German submarines or something away from the Panama Canal, then you better have a forward base that you can use that for surveillance to protect it. And, so there's great wisdom in this. Look, these are arguments that have to be put before the American people and say, listen, what do you want to happen? And I think that you say the best cure to say, look, there's no colonialism. We're no more colonizing Greenland than we were colonizing Kentucky when it became a state in like 1810 or so. You just simply say, look, this is just, they want to join America. They want to be part of this. And look, he says the Greenlanders, look, you'll get rich because you'll be out from the Danes in the European Union, and you'll be defended because in the current somewhat ambiguous status of Greenland, if 1,000 Chinese soldiers or Russian just showed up and said, our ship sank and we just rode here to shore in Greenland and we want to stay now, what would the Greenlanders do? Or if 1,000 Chinese soldiers said, we want to apply for asylum here in Greenland, what would they do? I mean, it's and they say, by the way, we want to apply for asylum, but of course we want to keep our weapons. All of a sudden we end up with something for America to think about. It would be pretty horrible if the Chinese had a military base in Greenland. It'd be worse. It'd be bad for the United States. It'd be worse for Greenland. They don't want to turn it into North Korea.
Fantastic, fascinating answers that will shape our future. And now I want to pass on to our resident history buff, Wyatt.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this is such a fascinating and interesting topic. So I wanted to get, so you were saying in your remarks that you would probably favor Greenland becoming a state. If I'm not mistaken, it has a population around 56,000 people, which would make it the smallest state by far. Do you think that the population size would contribute or should limit it becoming a state when we have like territories such as Puerto Rico, which have things like 5 million people?
Yeah, it would be an issue. It would definitely be an issue. And again, Puerto Ricans have debated back and forth on whether they want to be a state or not, and I'm not exactly sure they're not a state. I know that much. I'm not exactly sure what public opinion or something in Puerto Rico today would say. But again, there's a definite process by which Puerto Rico could or could not become a state. And yes, Greenland is incredibly small population. I would say underpopulated. I would say again they would benefit from a lot of Americans or coming there to live and have territory and land and a backyard and so on. Admittedly under ice, but still, it would be great. It would be an issue. It would be, and people would say, are you going to give Greenland 2 U.S. senators on a population of 50,000 when, California has 40 million into it. But of course, again, you're a historian or a future historian. We've done this kind of thing before. In 1864, the Union made Nevada into a state. And it had a tiny population. I'm not sure what it was, but if Nevada had a population in 1864 of more than 10,000, I'd be shocked. But they wanted to be a state, frankly, because they wanted to make sure they won the 1864 presidential election. They wanted the 3 electoral votes for Nevada on their side. And so, and again, the political decision to make North and South Dakota different states, both with tiny populations, but giving them 2 senators each, was made, I think, in 1890. It was a calculation. It was, it's the, sausage making, as I say, about politics. And so, both parties, I think it's in America's interest to have Greenland as a state, no matter who they vote for. But both parties would obviously be making the kind of calculations that you allude to as to how they want this to happen and under what terms. And remember, you can negotiate also on your way into the Union. You can negotiate all sorts of provisions. For example, when Texas joined the Union in 1846 or 7 or 8, in there somewhere, they wrote in, we don't want any Indian reservations. They wrote that in as a stipulation of becoming a state. They said no Indian reservations. And that's why Texas doesn't have any. Oklahoma's got lots. Texas doesn't have any. Again, you say that's a good idea or a bad idea, but those are the kinds of provisos that the Greenlanders would be perfectly free to say, look, as part of our process of negotiating with the United States and under Article 4 as to whether to join the Union, we want X, Y, and Z, whatever they are.
Interesting. Yeah. So if the United States were to acquire Greenland, do you think that this would affect our relationship at all, specifically like with Denmark, who is a pretty strong ally of the United States? Would this impact it in a significant way, do you think?
Well, I think it could be seen as a win-win. I hope that would certainly be the goal. Again, look, the Danes, Denmark's a country about a population like 5 or 6 million. It's an affluent country that has chosen not to spend anything on defense. It's a member of the European Union, it's a member of NATO. They think they have other priorities than defense, including this green energy windmill stuff and so on. And and so therefore they are by themselves completely helpless against the Russians. And again, remember, Russia now is a scary country. If you ask the Ukrainians, the Russians now are getting all sorts of help from China, and they literally have North Korean troops fighting for them. They're North Korean troops on the Ukraine-Russia border that they are therefore only a few hundred miles from Vienna or Berlin or Copenhagen, Denmark, and they're 10,000 miles away or whatever it is from North Korea. I mean, it's the thought that Europe could confront troops from North Korea. It's like Genghis Khan all over again in terms of and the Europeans have to think about that, and they have to think, how could we defend ourselves against this? I mean, if you open up the news now, you see Chinese and Russian fishing boats are busy cutting cables all over, the Baltic Sea, to name one, and so on. So I think the Danes have to realize, look, we in Denmark are potentially really up against being conquered by some combination of Russia, China, and North Korea. And we need the Americans to do that. And, the Americans are saying, why do we spend, 900 billion on defense when the Danes spend, 50 cents, as it were? And so maybe the bargain is kind of Greenland as an asset. I mean, if you want to see a long-term relationship between any 2 players, it has to have some degree of reciprocity. I do for you, you do for me. That's what makes it a symmetrical and kind of lasting and robust. And if it's just simply asymmetrical, where I help you and you don't do anything for me back, then it gets tiresome after a while. And Trump has made it clear that he thinks that the United States' inordinate exercise of expenditures on behalf of Europe and NATO is just, not, I want to put words in his mouth, it's not a good idea the way it is. And so what will the Danes do that could help on that? And one idea is Greenland.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you brought up a lot of interesting points and true points too. I mean, how big of a threat that Russia and I mean it's aligning with China and North Korea and all these foreign adversaries of ours. Um, Another question that I had, so say if because like we said, as we've all mentioned, it's not certainty that this would play out, the purchase of Greenland. But do you think maybe a more realistic approach would be maybe a mutual defense treaty or some sort of that agreement between the two of Greenland and the United States? Maybe discuss like how that would also be beneficial. What might some of the differences be?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of precedent for that too. The United States first landed in a big way in Hawaii in the 1860s, 1850s. And, again, Hawaii at that time was an independent, you can't quite say country. It was an independent sort of kingdom, sort of. And at about the same time that we, and, Dole Pineapple and whoever went to Hawaii, and missionaries, a lot of missionaries, went to Hawaii. Other powers were starting to float around the Pacific too, mostly Germany or Prussia, then Germany, and Japan. I mean, that during that era, the Japanese and Germans were both getting, as we saw in the 20th century, kind of aggressive. And so it became an issue. Again, you're the kingdom of Hawaii and you're kind of tribal and, not very advanced, but you're starting to notice, gosh, who do I want conquering me? Do I want these Americans who are nice and give us Bibles, or I want the Germans or the Japanese? It kind of becomes a choice after a while, and this is the kind of choice that all these physically very attractive places all across the Pacific Ocean. They're beautiful places, pretty nice climate, everything, tiny populations, and one gunboat from some foreign power shows up and says, "Look, we're in charge." All of a sudden, of Tahiti or Saipan or something like that. You don't have much of a choice about how to resist. So over a 30 or 40-year period from the 1850s into longer than that, we first started making landfall in Hawaii in a big way in the 1850s. Hawaii became a U.S. possession in 1897, and it became a state in 1959. So it was a 100-year process of getting to know you, what they would say in diplomatic terms of mutual confidence building, where, look, you do this, we'll do that, back and forth, back and forth. And over time, you get used to each other and decide, yeah, we'd like to become a state. I think that you could see that kind of process happening with Greenland. It just, look, let's see what happens if, you build a Trump Tower in Nuuk, Greenland, see how that goes. And if that works out well and you're happy with it, then what's the next thing you do? New mining concession, a new military base, a new something or other, some sort of exchange program. Again, there's lots of things, that the United States can do to sweeten the pot on this. We will provide academic scholarships to Greenland students to go to school in the United States. We'll build, sewers and reservoirs or whatever it is you're looking for out there. Things that the Danes, have never done. And at least in an adequate way, and just make a million different choices like that. And it may well be a long process, is what I'm saying.
Wow. Yeah, very fascinating. Well, I am all out of time, and I know that the audience has a lot of questions, so I will pass it on back. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I have a quick question for you, Jim, before we go to audience questions. We have a little bit of, it's like I have like a minute or two with you here, and then we have to go to audience questions. This has been really informational, Jim, and Wyatt, Jewel, Jorn, very informative, intriguing. I echo what has been said here, which is if someone has a imperialistic slant on perhaps acquiring Greenland, just think about this, where it's logistically located. And this is Janine Turner, by the way, for those that are listening and can't see me. And look at where Greenland is, which is this perfect spot. It's like prime real estate, right? It's like real estate, real estate, real estate, the land, the land, the land. But all you have to think about is this, as we were saying earlier, this alliance of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and how we need to gear ourselves up against that potential alliance as much as possible. And getting Greenland more protected could be a wonderful defense. So I think that's something that could be said, which is already said, and I'm just summing it up. But my question for you is, and I believe this has been, because you could talk about Americans have to agree with it, Americans have to understand it. This would be, if the negotiation takes place, this would be considered a treaty. And on Constitution of America, would it not? I talk a lot about the difference between a treaty, which is any agreement according to the Federalist Papers that with a foreign nation that has to be approved by the Senate, and an executive agreement, which a president can do, which I guess they did with World War II, the one after World War II, if that was an executive agreement. But a president can do that, but then the next president can overturn it, but it does not have to be ratified by the Senate when it's an executive agreement. So I think executive agreements are a little sneaky because they bypass the check and balance of the Constitution, which is the Senate should approve this treaty, and this is a monumental treaty, and then that gives, since the Senate's approving it, that gives the American people a voice in it. It's not just an executive branch, one branch going. It's really a wonderful check and balance in our Constitution. So do you think this would be done as a treaty or an executive agreement?
Well, one of the trends, for better or worse, has been that presidents have just gotten the habit now of doing, as you say, executive agreements and not treaties. Treaties are hard. Treaties take 2/3 of the Senate, and they're very, very difficult. And the fight over giving up the Panama Canal that Jimmy Carter led in 1977, it was an epic fight for a year, and again, I think probably a bad decision, and certainly Ronald Reagan opposed it back then, but it was a treaty and very difficult. Just in the last decade or so, two agreements that, were also extremely controversial, the Iran nuclear deal. President Obama to set up, it's not a treaty. It was a deal, and by sort of most reckonings, it should have been a treaty, but Obama said it's not a treaty, and so they didn't do it. He sent it to the Senate, not saying it takes 2/3 to agree to the agreement. He said send it to the Senate saying it takes 2/3 to oppose it. And it was a tricky thing.
None of that was truly constitutional. It's in a skirt around the Constitution, which is one of my pet peeves. And if the American people don't understand that all deals with a foreign nation's a treaty, it should be a treaty.
I agree. You agree. Obama did it, and then Trump undid it in 2018, and then so it's just one of those things. Also, the Paris Climate Accord, which I'm not a fan of, was also not a treaty. So presidents are moving.
Well, just so our listeners understand, if it becomes an executive agreement, and I got to go so we can get to questions here, but if it becomes an executive agreement and Trump does all this negotiation, say for 4 years, and finally gets Greenland, the next president can just come in and overturn it. So there's something to be said about the permanence of a Senate-approved treaty instead of an executive agreement as well.
You're right. However, a president might say, "I'd rather get it quick and dirty the way I want it, as opposed to through a treaty." I mean, it's just presidents have to make.
Look, the Iranian deal was overturned, so I don't know. It's a thought-provoking question, and definitely strips it away from a check and balance and from the American people.
And
it would be really hard to get 2/3 of the Senate, though, wouldn't it?
Congress should be more assertive and say, "Listen, we consider this to be a treaty, and we won't consider it valid unless it's a treaty." On the other hand, then the president will say, look, to his own party, "Look, you're not being loyal to me if you insist on making a treaty when I just make it a deal." I tend to support the Constitution as it is. I guess probably we all do. It's one of those things, as observers of American politics in the 21st century, we just should sort of notice, whether we like it or not, and whether we plan to do anything about it or not, that presidents have preferred, if they can, to operate by some sort of their own executive authority, even if they're pumping it up too much.
They're just not long lasting. It can be overturned. So it's like a shallow victory in a way. But worthy of thought. Okay, I'm gonna toss it to Jewel for questions now. Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
And so quickly, I'd like to recognize, and if I say any names wrong, it is my fault completely. So I'm sorry, but I want to recognize you, even if I mispronunciate. Santiago Villegas, who is listening at AZ Leadership. D'Angela Hines, Emerald Coast Christian Academy with 3 students. Colette Bowdish, who is listening with 18 homeschooled students. And Michelle Wiseman, who's listening with the homeschooled students. We love doing what we do and helping these students understand these topics, which was a fabulous topic today. Thank you all for listening. I also want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. Our Constituting America Constitutional Chats air on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific on that radio station. So thank you so much for airing the chats, and we thank you listeners for listening to them. So I got some audience questions and some comments. Everyone has loved this discussion. So we've got only a couple minutes left. Robert Spiegler asks, is the Isle of Man in the same situation as Greenland? Do you know anything about that, Jim?
I confess I don't. This stuff is so precise. Again, you can be an international lawyer and practice international law for 50 years and know all this stuff, and I don't. I don't exactly know. I mean, the Isle of Man, again, there's many islands around England. I mean, or Great Britain. There's the Isle of Man, and there's Guernsey and Jersey, and there's lots of them. And I don't know their exact status within the United Kingdom. Do they have representation in Parliament? I don't know. But again, as you look at a map of any little patch of the world, you say
I have the answer. I have the answer. The island is a self-governing British Crown dependency with its own parliament, government, and laws. Well, or whatever that.
Interesting.
See, there's a new word, dependency. We've been talking about protectorates and territories. Now dependency. I don't, again, international law is complicated. Each country has its own law on top of that. So now we know, thanks to Janine, that, Jersey and Guernsey have their own little tiny parliament. I mean, these are countries, these are islands with populations in the tens of thousands at most. Okay, they are very small, and so, but they have their own little parliament. Okay, fair enough. Now we know.
Yeah. So, there's a concern for one of the listeners. Ernie Fur says, if we took Greenland, my concern would be how Russia and China would react. Would they take Ukraine and Taiwan respectively?
Well, that's an issue. That's exactly the sort of question that would come up. Is this, are we, does our possession of Greenland in any way change our attitude toward Ukraine or Taiwan? That's just, this is the kind of stuff Wyatt was touching on. I don't have an answer. I mean, again, the only answer I can think of is let's put this before the American people through the constitutional process and debate. And again, look, there's nothing more fascinating than to read the debates over these kinds of treaties and stuff as they were, because again, this is the glory of a legislature. You have 100, or whatever the number is, currently 100 U.S. senators saying, "What about this? And what about this? And what about this?" You learn a lot, and it's sort of almost like a intellectual process where between Alaska and Florida, some U.S. or in Maine and California, some U.S. senator will raise the issue of exactly this: Ukraine, Taiwan, Andorra, and pick any place, Estonia, any place you want, and these should be considered. This is exactly
one final question. Just want to squeeze in here because there's so many. Last one, Edwin Martinez just asks how you can interpret the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8.
Well,
and if that is
necessary
anywhere
proper is one of those phrases that sort of covers you. It's sort of the example, where the Constitution is brilliance said, look, here we are writing it in 1787. It's not possible for us to foresee all the possible circumstances, all the possible technology, all the possible everything. So we need some language here and there, like necessary and proper, that allows the sort of, as it were, lubrication to permit the state, the United States, to function like this. And so, yes, There's a whole bunch of international lawyers who would jump in and say, what about this? And there's probably 50 other clauses of the Constitution that some other lawyer would cite as pro or con in this debate. And that's what, the Congress and the president and the American people have to resolve. And it makes it such a fascinating topic.
Yeah, I would just step in and say, in regard to the Ukraine comparison, is that, Ukraine was a military invasion and takeover. Whereas if the treaty happens with Greenland, it would be a mutual agreement between two countries who mutually benefit and want to do it. So I think but that doesn't mean that Russia and China won't try to manipulate it as such, but there's a vast difference between the two approaches for sure. Okay, so go back. I'm tossing it back to you, Jewel. I'll let you go out. Jim, thank you. Jordan, thank you.
Right.
Wyatt, thank you. Jewel, thank you. And everybody, thank you for watching, and our sponsors today. And Jewel, and Wyatt, if you want to say something, Jim.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.